Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Darren Shan reread video. This one is going to be my review for book number 8, which is called Allies of the Night. So this is the second book of the third, I suppose, trilogy of books overall. The Vampire War trilogy, I believe it's called, or Vampire Hunter trilogy. And yeah, this book, obviously based on the title, the focus of this is sort of about the characters that are reintroduced from some of the earlier books. They are, of course, Debbie, RV, and then most notably Steve. All come back into the story in this book in their own kind of unique and different ways. And it's definitely a great book in terms of the references, and it makes a lot of sense the way they go with each of the characters. The other thing about it that's kind of interesting is that it's the return of a character from book 1, the return of a character from book 2, and also from book 3. So Steve from book 1, RV from book 2, and Debbie from book 3 all return in this specific book. The other thing, obviously, and you see it sort of on the back sort of blurb, is that like, oh wait, what? He goes back to school? What a weird thing to sort of do, and almost like a risky thing in the middle of, like, right as your big end game sort of plot is getting going, to place the main character back in this kind of really awkward situation of like he has to go back to school. I think what really like makes it work and sort of saves it is that him going to the school serves as the way for Darren to actually encounter Debbie in like a kind of reasonable way, in terms of like, oh yeah, that absolutely makes sense why that character, the way she was, would go on to become a teacher. And Darren being sent to this school, especially when you realize towards the end of the book that Steve obviously sort of manipulated this, and that they're all like, wait, what? How does this inspector know about like my like birth certificate and stuff like that? And that it's clearly doctored because it's like Darren Horston and so on. How did this even happen? And obviously it's the fact that Steve reveals that he's basically been stalking Darren and like has been doing all of this research to know about every single thing that Darren has done. So knowing his connection to Debbie, to Mr. Crepsley, the best way to kind of engineer this sort of a situation is to force him to have to go to school to like distract him from the hunt in a way. And especially because it happens like right as Mr. Crepsley leaves, and obviously Vancha has left as well to give word about the hunt basically starting, and then Mr. Crepsley has to go back because they find out news that Paris Skyle, the oldest vampire, has died. That was a kind of a surprise reveal, but it sort of makes sense. They've been like teasing that like the whole book, that's the kind of way it has been going, especially when they reveal like what exactly happened to him when he felt that like he was on his last legs. He went out into the mountain, the area surrounding the mountain, and fought a bear until he died. So very much the vampire way to go out. So that was kind of, you know, an interesting small thing, but ultimately one that made sense, and that's why Vanja had to actually stay back a little more, because he had to actually do some of his duties as prince in the aftermath of the death of one of the princes. So yeah, you're left with this sort of situation where Mr. Crepsley's there at the start for a little bit, but then he leaves, and it's like Darren and Harkat like on their own, and then Darren is like has to go off to school, so it like the hunt is kind of on hold basically for a while. Harkat's the only one like actively able to do anything, with Darren having to go to school. And the reveal of Debbie, I think, is great because we're obviously in the right place for, you know, her to be introduced, and that you have Darren reflecting on like knowing the location that they are, and that, oh yeah, like last time I was here, you know, there was this, you know, connection with Debbie, and he kind of like thinks like, oh, imagine I ran into her again, and he ends up actually doing that in the school. And what I like about it so much is that she immediately recognizes him. That even though he should be like 10 years older, he should look 10 years older than he actually is, she straight away recognizes him. And he obviously, of course, recognizes her. And I think what's so well done with this dynamic and it coming back is that you can see that in so many ways both characters have never forgot the other one. and that this would have been this like kind of perfect match if things had just been normal. They would have been this like kind of perfect couple. And in so many ways, they get so close to almost restarting their relationship. But it's the issues surrounding Darren's aging that kind of get in the way. Otherwise, their dynamic is pretty much back to normal. It seems like after a couple of like meetings and they're kind of hanging out a lot. It feels like it's getting there, but just that difference in just how they look, even though she knows Darren is basically the same age as her, it's just something that is extremely difficult to overcome. And so it's just another one of these sort of like, kind of tragedies of just exactly what's happened to Darren, of like it being so directly brought up here. It was one thing, the tragedy of like he had this relationship and then had to leave it behind in book 3. It's another thing to sort of return and kind of see that this relationship would absolutely work and that they have the same chemistry like 10 years later, but it still can't happen, and it just being sort of like thrown in his face again. And so this book, as a way to just bring up the past, works really, really well for me. So they obviously have to eventually bring Debbie in on board, especially once the whole, it seems like the Murloc situation from book 3 is happening again. And this time it's RV who's actually the one behind it. And that's an interesting one in that you see that he is going down the exact path as Murloc of like becoming this really wild, out of control Vampanese. And you see him being reintroduced with the hooks on both of his hands, because his hands were obviously like eaten by the Wolfman. And in that case, it's like RV blames Darren for what happened to him, even though it was basically his own meddling in things and thinking that he knew more about the Wolfman and trying to like think about the safety of the Wolfman, that's what got him into trouble. Yes, you can maybe blame Darren for, how much he did or did not tell RV back at the time, but ultimately Darren did the best that he could to try and, like, I suppose, protect the Cirque, and it was his own meddling that made that happen. And that's what's so interesting as well about the reintroduction of Steve, in that I obviously, my memory of this was that I thought that Steve was reintroduced in book 7 and that he was with Darren as like an ally for a little bit longer than here. So I really forgot that for the most part, Steve being kind of an ally of Darren again is like a little bit over like half of this book. But at the same time, I actually appreciated it in rereading it here that the writer didn't particularly attempt to overdo like Steve as an ally for too long. That because he's pretty quickly reintroducing you to a lot of the elements you learned about in the first book. That like Steve has evil blood, that he's never forgotten that Darren ultimately has never forgotten that, Mr. Krebsley has never forgotten that. That is this like huge plot point that really can't be forgotten. That especially when Mr. Krebsley comes back and is just like, yeah, that wasn't just a thing where like I thought you had like a bad personality to become a vampire that you wouldn't fit in with us. No, I honestly feel that you actually have evil blood and that you are a truly evil person. That it wasn't just like a turn of phrase, like he truly means it. And you can tell just how much like Steve, especially once the turn happens, is affected by this. And that's what's so interesting about the sort of backstory they give for Steve to explain why he hasn't gone on to sort of become a vampire hunter. He tried to do that, but instead actually the backstory before the eventual truth comes out is that he learned basically the truth about vampires and so on, learned about Vampanese, but actually learned that vampires are honorable and it's the Vampanese who are the bad ones. And he basically became a Vampanese hunter after that. And for the most part, he sort of talks about how he was hurt by what Mr. Krebsley said to him and just the way everything went down. But that in the end, like his hatred sort of ended up like roughly like fading away overall. Let me just get to the page here. I have it marked. Gradually his hatred subsided. He still resented me for going off with Mr. Krebsley, but accepted the fact that I hadn't done it to spite him. When he looked back at the past, he saw that I'd given up my family and home to save his life and hadn't tricked or plotted against him. That's when he dropped his crazy quest. He stopped searching for us, put all thoughts of revenge from his mind, and sat down to work on what he was going to do with the rest of his life. But, he went on to become a Vampanese hunter, and he tells Darren the story of how he killed his first Vampanese and so on. And I think that's pretty cool in terms of like, oh, that's an interesting turn. You can sort of get behind the idea that like he's taken what Mr. Crepsley said to him to heart and realized that, yes, the way he felt about Darren at the end of the first book and Mr. Crepsley was leading him down this path where he would become too engulfed in hatred, and he purposefully changed that and stopped hating them and so on. Obviously, it's revealed to be a lie, and that he hasn't forgotten this. And I think that's the big thing here of like the evil blood comment is true. That when Steve ultimately reveals himself by taking Debbie hostage, he still feels, in the same way sort of as RV, that Darren did this to him. He thinks that Darren purposefully hurt him with Madame Octa and plotted with Mr. Crepsley to sort of take that life away from him and give it to Darren and all of that stuff. He doesn't see what has actually happened, which is that Darren did sacrifice himself for Steve. Now, obviously, it was an accident. Darren could have made different choices that might have prevented that whole incident from happening. But it fundamentally was an accident how that happened. Again, it was that I think Annie burst into the room right in the middle of like a delicate situation of the performance, and that's when Steve was bitten. So it's one of those things where you can't overly blame Darren for everything, and it's very much the case of Steve being utterly lost in the past, and Darren is ultimately able to accept that Steve back into his life, and he's kind of arguing with the others for him, and you see that like, okay, Steve is getting on well with Harkat. He tries to like defend Steve when he introduces him to like Mr. Crepsley again and so on, and it seems like it's going okay, but in the end the truth comes out, and we see just how just consumed by hatred he sort of has become, of like when the reveal finally comes out of like he's done research, he found out everything he could about them, he made it his life's work. He traced them down, found the birth certificate, connected him to this place and so on, and that's why he did all of this. And you saw an element of that back in book 1 with the whole idea that like Steve snuck into the morgue where Darren's body was and took pictures of his hands. That is not the actions of someone sort of normal to like sneak in to investigate after your friends just died. It's like, whoa, and you almost forget that the intensity that at which Steve did a lot of that stuff at the end of the first book. And this is much more like that Steve, and we see that it was just an act for most of the book. This is how he actually is. And, Darren's like, why do you hate us? We did nothing to hurt you. And again, the key point, he said I was evil, and you chose his side over mine. You set that spider on me and tried to kill me. And Darren says, no, I saved you. I gave up everything so that you could live. Nonsense. I know what really happened. You plotted with him against me so you could take my rightful place among the vampires. You were jealous of me. And at this point, Darren realizes he can't negotiate with Steve here. He can't get through to him. He just feels this way, and nothing he can do changes that. And especially when they reveal here that Steve is half Vampanese, you realize that even now he is still sort of driven by this sense of, I wanted to become a vampire, but I've become a Vampanese to get back at you kind of type thing. And obviously, this is way before some of the really big reveals happen. I think in the next book is the kind of big one. I do think in reading it again, it feels pretty obvious where they're ultimately leading with all of this. The like sudden reintroduction of Steve at this point, and how it kind of coincides with the quest to get the Lord of the Vampaneze and so on. To me, being able to make more of the connections here in this reading compared to when I was much younger, I think it comes across a bit more obviously that this is the situation, especially when you connect a lot of what like Mr. Tiny told them in combination with other stuff of like what Curda said, like, oh, the Lord of the Vampaneze has recently been discovered, and he hasn't been blooded yet because he's too young. He's recently been blooded at, you know, the time when Darren was X age, and so, oh, Steve and Darren are the same age, like, oh, there's your connection. It obviously hasn't come out yet because Steve's doing an excellent job here of acting as just being a normal vampire, and this scene obviously plays out in such a way where the action sequence towards the end, the hostage situation, plays out in such a way where like very little importance is placed on Steve outside of RV, because they establish that Steve was the one who made the hook arms for RV, and they have a sort of connection, so RV is loyal to Steve. And because Steve is a good sort of plotter, he is sort of a respected Vampaneze, but he's not being treated as anyone like super high up or anything like that. So Ganon, who's obviously speaking for most of the Vampaneze here, and they also have the robed Lord of the Vampaneze there, that's what their focus is. But then you have the interesting situation of like, it's, I think they confirm it's like 28 on like 4 is the situation that we have here. And all of the characters note that the Vampaneze are fighting in very unusual ways. And even though they're completely against the odds, they should be completely killed here. They're managing to survive without really getting badly injured or anything like that. And so it sort of brings up this situation of, in the same way that our characters on the quest to hunt down the Lord of the Vampaneze were set rules by Mr. Tiny, the same has to be true for the Vampaneze side of things. Mr. Tiny told them all of this stuff too, about this quest, and they obviously have a similar sort of counter quest to the hunters. They know about the 5 destined, you know, points of contact where they'll threaten to win at these points, lose at these points. And I think you can see that here in that Ganon makes the kind of unusual request of like, we have the numbers advantage, but we know if we just try and go to kill you here right out in the open, many of us will die trying to just take you down. So instead, what we'll do here to, you know, try and make some sense of this hostage situation, because again, what's happened is that Steve takes Debbie hostage, but then the fighting breaks out because Vansha makes a big move in terms of he hesitated at the first meeting and lost them the first opportunity. So he doesn't hesitate here and goes straight after Ganon and the Lord of the Vampaneze. And this takes everyone by surprise. Like, Mr. Crepsley jumps straight into action, Harkat does. But Darren obviously has to deal with the fact that Steve has Debbie hostage. But he uses this as an advantage to, you know, throw a knife at Steve. He has to drop Debbie, but RV ends up holding Debbie hostage. So this allows, you know, Darren to basically go after Steve. And he basically has Steve sort of dead to rights here. He's about to kind of kill him until RV reveals he has Debbie hostage. And this is sort of like, oh, another similar type of situation where something is about to happen, but there's this choice given to one of the hunters. Do they go ahead with this at the expense of someone else? So Vansha is like dealing with his brother who he hasn't seen in so long. He hesitates and can't bring himself to get over it. Darren here can't bring himself to let Debbie die to take out Steve. There's all these kind of interesting, you know, situations going on here that you're kind of waiting for, like, oh, that means that sort of there's been an opportunity for Darren, an opportunity for Vansha. Is Mr. Crepsley's opportunity next, or what? It's very interesting to consider. So yeah, the RV ends up just running off completely with Debbie, because he realizes that he has the advantage here, because they all know that, like, Debbie is more or less like Darren's girlfriend, and that because there's that love connection, they know they have a more important hostage than Darren does. That, okay, RV cares about Steve, but it's nowhere near the same way that Darren cares about Debbie. So he just runs off, knowing that Darren is, obviously one of the kind of good characters, isn't going to just kill someone right there in the middle of everything. But the Gannon comes up with the interesting idea to, like, okay, we will give you 15 minutes. Take your hostage with you, and if you get away, fine. But if we find you, we'll kill you. And it's just this deal to sort of avoid a lot of injuries in this just open battlefield. Whereas he feels pretty confident that if they can catch them after the 15 minutes, they'll catch them in such a way where they'll be easily able to take out the hunters, and they won't lose many of their forces because they'll basically be ambushing them in all of the tunnels underneath this town, of course, because we're basically like here kind of in the tunnels of blood from book 3, which I think is a pretty cool sort of callback of just the terrible things that happen under Mr. Krebsley's like kind of home city type thing. And that's where we end. Is just that the book ends on a big cliffhanger of like Darren has Steve hostage. They're being allowed to sort of get away, but it's still like 20 versus 4. And then Debbie's been taken off somewhere else by RV. What's happening here? How is this going to work? And it's just getting away from, like, they see the Lord of the Vampaneze there and they're suddenly forced to retreat away from him. How will this all, play out in the end? Darren is going to do everything he can to not let Debbie die. And I really like that Mr. Krebsley stands up for Darren here. Of like, no, I know Darren. He is not going to stand down. He will not let anything happen to her. So I will stand by him over this. That was a nice kind of display of loyalty from Mr. Krebsley to Darren, in that there was no sort of calling out Darren for like making the wrong move here. They understood why he would do this, and I think that's just a really kind of nicely done scene. And other than that, is there anything else to really talk about here? It's just a really, kind of heavy moment. All of this stuff from the past coming back up, and the accusations of like, Darren, you are responsible for what happened to RV. You're responsible for what happened to Steve. And obviously, he has to accept that, the way things went, like those chaotic moments in the earlier books, were partly his fault, but not to the extent the characters are sort of blaming him for. In that, in many ways, Steve is arguably more angry at Mr. Krebsley specifically, and Darren is just like a part of that because, they were close friends, and he's more angry at Darren because he's now friends with Mr. Krebsley, and Mr. Krebsley blooded him instead of Steve, and that's quite fun. And even like, I think RV is the big callback that like you really don't expect, but it arguably does make sense for like this character to just have this complete turnaround of like, he tried to do this good thing for the Wolfman, but he was meddling too much. He gets horrifically injured and runs off into the forest, seemingly just to die, but somehow manages to survive. Steve encounters him, obviously because he's sort of been basically tracking Darren over the years, and basically when he becomes part of the Vampaneze, he gets RV blooded too. He makes him the hook arms, and boom, he has an ally who hates Darren just as much as he does. It's actually a really good group of characters to put together. Now, ultimately you ask the question, does Steve actually care about RV? I don't think so. I think he's just using him to... because I don't even remember the specific nature of like where exactly they go with RV, but just knowing Steve as a character, I really don't think there's a lot of loyalty here. And it's just... oh, you feel the same way about Darren as I do, so you'll be useful going forward. And he's getting that exact value out of him here in this situation. That the reason he's not being killed straight away here is because RV has Debbie hostage. So, there's a lot of stuff going on here that this series isn't afraid to kill characters. So you are worried about Debbie, and because you're not really sure of like if their relationship can or can't happen, they could be willing to just kill this character, and so the stakes are like extremely high, even though you know we haven't had like enough encounters yet for like Mr. Krebsley or Vansha to die, because we know sort of Darren is going to be safe like pretty much all the way up until like the last encounter that they have again. The situation was that Mr. Tiny told them they'd have 5 encounters with the Lord of the Vampaneze, or attempts to like defeat him. One's gone because they executed Kurda. The second one is gone because of the incident at the end of the last book with Vansha pausing. And then obviously at this point in the story, we don't know yet if like this moment here is still in progress or this is a missed opportunity that's happened already, and so on. So we're sort of theoretically in the middle of the third opportunity. So you know, that still leaves the final opportunity where Mr. Krebsley and Vansha will be alive, and then the potential fated last encounter where only Darren might be left. So that's a really interesting setup of like, because we have characters with future sight basically, we have some sense for like how things are going to go, and characters who can and can't die and all of this, but all human characters and like Harkat as well are all, you know, free to kind of do whatever they want in these situations. So Debbie, like something terrible could happen to Debbie, something bad could happen to Harkat, but you sort of know Harkat is kind of safe for now because we're still waiting to find out who was he before he was made into a little person. That's been his plot for so long, and they didn't really focus on it that much here, so that's going to have to happen at some point. So is it my favorite book of the lot? Not really, because I suppose until you get to sort of the final action sequence and the big reveal happens of like Steve is Vampaneze, the decision to go back to school, like it means that we slow down a little bit. We're in the middle of the hunting quest, which we only kind of got started in the last book, and then we sort of stopped almost straight away. So it's just like an interesting decision to sort of like really kind of bring the hunting plot to a sort of halt, and the incident with the Vampaneze almost just like appears almost out of nowhere, because of course it went cold at the end of the last book, and they just decided, okay, there's killings going on in Mr. Krebsley's hometown, so we'll go there, and it ends up turning into something and becomes even more messy because Vansha and Mr. Krebsley both had to leave and then come back. So interesting stuff, but yeah, still really enjoyable book. I'm not having any like major issues going back to it like at all, really. I think it's all of the books have been really enjoyable, entertaining. The story, characters are still holding up for me for sure. About the only thing that maybe feels a little bit like maybe not as good as it was when I read it the first time was just that it's maybe a little bit easier to see the plot sort of and where it's going. A few of the maybe foreshadowing moments are a little bit too on the nose in terms of like, oh yeah, because you said that means this is going to happen. In that, like, if you remember the whole Steve Evil Blood comment, it's kind of difficult to not, especially when he returns, immediately connect the dots through all the Mr. Tiny stuff and realize who Steve actually is. But you know, we have to wait until next week to get the full reveal on that. So we're going to finish the Vampire War trilogy with book 9 next week, Killers of the Dawn. Yeah, this is a pretty big book. Some pretty crazy stuff happens in this one, and then we're going to get into the final trilogy to bring the series to an end. So yeah, we're 2/3 of the way through here as of book 8. So it's been enjoyable so far, but that's been the video. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were, but thanks for watching, and bye.